he deserves to die because he's killed the Lord's priests. When I find him, I'll kill him. He's not going to kill any more priests of God. Now, if David had a reason to kill Saul, he had one. And it seems like that God's children always have reasons to do their dirty work if they want to do it. Well, I'll tell you why I'm doing this. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because you. See, in other words, when you're set to sin, then you'll always have a reason why you're doing what you're doing. In other words, David had good reason to kill Saul. Saul had absolutely killed 85 men of God. He had killed 85 priests of God. Isn't that a good enough reason to kill that man? Isn't that a good enough reason to do it? And yet when David could have killed Saul, he wouldn't do it. In other words, nothing happened that would justify David's humanity in having its own way. Why do you look for excuses to justify your damnable humanity when it's dead set to do something? See, you'll always find an excuse to justify your rebellious, human, iniquitous spirit because there's something you don't like. Now, David didn't like 85 priests of the Lord being killed. And if anything would have rose up in him in self-righteousness or hatred for Saul, this was an ample opportunity for him to be justified to get his sword out and kill him. And when something happens that you don't like, you can always use that as a reason for doing what's wrong and justify yourself in the process. But David never used that for a reason to kill Saul. And when Saul was in his own power, he never remembered the 85 priests that Saul killed and turned around and drove his sword through him. See? But David understood something here. He understood something that he couldn't help. And life is more than cream puffs and kitty cars. You have to get to the place where David said, when in verse 21 Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests, he'd also slain their wives, their fathers, their mothers, their children, and their cattle. And David said unto Abiathar, he said, I knew it. He said, I knew, and many times I know what people are going to do, but there's nothing I can do because I'd be in the wrong spirit if I did it. And I just have to let events take their course. And when events take their course, they may not be pleasant. And David had to have let events take their course. And they weren't pleasant. He said, and David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, and he would surely tell Saul. And David said, he said, I'm sorry. He said, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Now, David had to live with the fact that he was responsible for their death. But he was not responsible. He was not responsible. He couldn't help it. It was a situation that just worked out the way it did. He was there. Ahimelech helped him. Doeg saw it. And as a consequence, David understood. He said, I'm the reason they're dead. But David couldn't help it. He could not help it. But he was the reason they were dead. But he couldn't help it. He couldn't help it. He was innocent, and yet he was guilty. But he was not guilty to where God would judge him. He was not personally responsible, and yet because of the situation that existed, he was the cause of. But God couldn't judge him because it was not his fault. And David had to live with that. Like I said, life is more than cream puffs and kitty cars. We have to live with the consequences of the events of our lives as we move on from the beginning to the end. And they may have looked at David and said, you're responsible for their deaths. David said, I know it. But he couldn't help it. He was innocent. Life is more than just running the aisles and speaking in other tongues.